Good evening. Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. Tonight we have a very esteemed guest, Henry David Thoreau. Now, for those of you who don't know Henry was born in 1817, and according to this book about him, he died in 1862. So it's quite interesting. I'm going to have to ask him in a moment what the heck he's doing here. But at any rate, quick biography, born in 1817, died 1862. A great philosopher. People know him best for Walden Pond because he lived there for the better part of his life and lived a life of solitude. And you would think that maybe living a life of solitude would not give him the opportunity to observe other individuals or observe society in general. But he certainly seems to have gained a lot of knowledge in being in that solitude, and his observations are very interesting. First of all, I want to introduce him, Henry David Thoreau, back.
Thank you, David. And it's a pleasure to be here tonight. This is a new venue for me. I'm not used to this.
So you'll notice the screen out front. Now that screen is reflecting actually it's showing what we're doing at the moment.
Okay.
So don't be unnerved by it. It's just electrons, and I know you don't know much about electrons either, but they're just electrons that are bouncing around inside that contraption there, that what they call a television. But this is fantastic because to have you here is a great thing for me personally, because my good friend Robert Garavel is a student of Henry David Thoreau and has taught me a bit about him. Robert and I read poetry at the Brookfield Rehab Center, generally on Mondays, occasionally on Fridays, and we have some great times with some of the patients there and have marvelous conversations. And
he's an avid biker too, is he?
He is, as is another gentleman that's been on the show often, Dave Bonan, who's been biking exclusively for the past, I think, at least 10 years. And so there's some really interesting people still floating around in the world today that have gleaned a lot of what they believe in from your life, because you did some writing when you were alive, and you left quite a wonderful and powerful footprint for people to follow. But so here's the thing. You're back, and you're going to be making some observations, I hope, making some observations about modern-day society and what you've seen in this time that you've been back. Where have you traveled since you've been back? Have you been secreting yourself and hiding and watching and observing again?
I came back, Dave, rather anonymously with a very low profile. One of the reasons why I decided to come back, in my spiritual state, I happened to be over at a lake that reminded me much of Walden Pond. And it's right in this area too, by the way, Lake Kenosia. Oh,
that's great, because that's part of the Still River, as I've learned recently from Dave Bonan. It's part of the Still River, which is a very long, over 20-mile long river, which travels mostly through Danbury. I was astonished between the resemblance between that and Walden Pond. They're basically around the same size.
And they're basically a Walden Pond in my day when I was there was not as inhabited as Lake Kenosia. It's still a very peaceful and a very quiet lake. And the day I had visited the lake in my spiritual form, I happened to overhear two young people talking. And I was rather flattered that they brought my name up. And they were in a quandary as to, on such a beautiful day, there were not more people at... Kenosha Park is a public park, I surmise.
It sounds yeah.
They were wondering why, on a beautiful day, there were not a lot of people there. They were basically the only two people there. It was 65 degrees, and the sun was shining. It was, I believe, in August. And I overheard them say that they had just come back from a peace vigil. They had peace vigils in this area?
Yes, and peace, as it always has been throughout the history of the world, is a subject which is very strong and very important to a lot of people.
That's very encouraging to see that young people are so inclined towards the issues of war and peace, which I have always been a very big proponent of non-military solutions to conflict. But getting back to my intentions and coming back to the year 2011, I couldn't help but to overhear these young people in a sense of wonderment, and they were bewildered why more people weren't there today.
Did they have any answers to that, or did you?
Well, no, they quoted one of my short excerpts from one of my journals that was written, I believe, in around 1856, when I was bemoaning people becoming overly occupied with the tools of the time.
Yeah.
And I was concerned that the Industrial Revolution was tearing people away from the fabric of nature. And I said in my quote that I believe is in my, it may not be in that book.
Oh, I think it is. Go ahead. I think I've got it right here, but go ahead.
I said basically that people have become tools of their tools.
Tools of their tools. Does that mean, in a sense, that maybe things like cell phones and television and radio and these other things that we have captured us more than they should have?
We certainly have made, or society has evolved into a technological potpourri of what people have considered fascinating developments technologically. I'm not acquainted with a lot of them. In my period, the Industrial Revolution was just taking its foothold.
Yeah.
And I've seen in my short stay here, yes, there is overwhelming consumption and occupation of material possessions in the form of not only gadgets, but things that people have to pay for. For example, when I was in my day, we walked for exercise and walked free. Now, I believe they have these rooms that people go in. You have to help me because I'm not really familiar with the culture.
I'm sure this is all very, very
They walk into rooms and they have machines that they walk on.
Rather than
walking as I did or saunter through the woods.
Yeah.
The tools of our tools is my observation that tools were becoming an integral and not necessarily beneficial component of their lives, taking them away from the holistic aspect of nature.
So you lose a lot of observation in your people today maybe lose a lot of their observation of nature.
I couldn't help but to notice the other day, Dave, I was walking down the street and I happened to notice a number of young people and people that had wires sticking out of their ears. And I, because of my ignorance, and rightfully so, because I'm not really aware of a lot of the technology today, I asked a bystander what they were, and they were, it was a musical device that was going into their heads.
You might have thought when you first saw them that they were things that maybe a person might use if they were lacking quality to their hearing, if they had difficulty in hearing.
I thought maybe it was a device that may have helped them in hearing, but when I learned that it was music that they were pouring into their heads, I only could think of what about the beauty and the music that nature can offer, or the solitude of being in the presence of no noise, or listening to the wind, or listening to yourself.
A lot of folks nowadays worry about these devices that you're referring to, iPods and things of that nature.
That's what he referred to them as, yes.
People worry about that, not being so much tools to help people who are deaf, but tools that make people go deaf early because of the loudness of the volume of the music, which is being pushed into their eardrums.
I might add, Dave, that's one form of tool. I believe now we have other tools. We have computers. We have TVs. We have
television.
Television
sends the vision, sends visions across the airwaves.
So we're dealing with all these advances technologically that are not only a cost factor in people's economic lives, but they also have to be brought into a cost factor into the holistic well-being of the person in relating to the things that these devices cannot connect with, that are very essential. I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
If you're at the ocean, or if you're in the woods, which I spent a number of years in, I would find it very apprehensive to really be interrupted with anything that was interfering with the vibrations and the melody of nature. I have been quoted and have been labeled as being anti-people and somewhat misanthropic. That's not totally true. One of my statements was, the person is not nearly as instructive as the silence he breaks. That's not to demean human behavior. It's just to emphasize that the silence of nature has very much to say. The silence and the murmurings and the vocalations of nature.
I'm listening and I'm absorbing this, and I'm just absolutely fascinated by your point of view, because you've been obviously separated from a lot of the things that have happened since you've no longer been here, before you've returned. But certainly you're making some very interesting observations that I think young people probably think about. They probably think about these things, but they don't allow themselves enough time perhaps to think about those things, because they're absorbed in what's the technology that's being foisted on them.
This comes with a number of reasons. In my study of history, I looked at your 60s and 70s when you had a lot of young people that were rebelling against the consumption and the status quo of materialism.
Yep.
And this was a very positive sign, certainly not for the entrepreneurs, but it was certainly a significant sign in the well-being of our nation's spirituality, where people were questioning, do I need to have, in quotes, a big house? One of the things I would say quite frequently to a lot of my neighbors, it's amazing how many good people a small house will hold. This was something that was being promoted and being a big part of the culture of the 60s and 70s, where you had a lot of young people rebelling against the status quo or mass culture.
And you certainly didn't have to go too far back in at least in American history to find small homes containing large families.
Right, that was more reflective of that time. And as we evolved, it appeared that the status quo and a major tenet of the American mentality is bigger is better. And that goes as far as not only homes, but as far as material accumulation, and even so far as the vehicles.
The
automobiles that people drive. I notice a lot of big vehicles on the road now.
And certainly some of them are very small and some of them are very big, but I guess the common denominator between all these vehicles is they do sort of, particularly if you've got one person in a vehicle, which is quite often the case, that person is somewhat isolating themselves or allowing themselves to be isolated from everything going on around them, which seems to be very contradictory to what you did in exposing yourself to the smallest of sounds, the most simple of sounds.
Well, the problem with the genesis of the automobile and its eventual evolution is that it depersonalized and made people more, in quotes, antisocial, insofar as when you're transported, you're contained in this medical vehicle that does not give you the opportunity of communicating and socializing with people while you're walking, or even if you're on the long...
Like a treadmill, sort of.
No, a long vehicle that accompanies a lot of people. I think they call them buses.
Like a bus, yeah.
A bus. We call them trains in our times. A bus.
Yeah, but
those are very adaptable to society's ability to socialize more.
You're making a really cogent case when people have said that you isolated yourself at the pond listening to the beauty of nature and the sounds of nature. You're making a pretty clear case for the fact that those people that see that you having done that are really themselves doing that and not being as observative as you, I would guess, would have been. Because all of us that have been in a situation like you, even for an hour or a day where we actually have time to stop and not have sounds going on around us and to just listen to the beauty of nature and the simplicity of nature, learn an awful lot in that short period of time. I don't know if anybody nowadays could really handle a long, extended, sitting by a lake for goodness gracious, for an entire day. I think that would drive a lot of people just plain batty. But I think they can appreciate doing that for a shorter period of time and can appreciate what you did.
Well, it reminds me, Dave, of, I believe it was in the year it's the summer of 1853. Mm-hmm. I was by Walden.
So you were in your 30s then?
I was in my 30s, and I didn't live to see 50, but I lived to see an awful lot that most people didn't see. And if I sound self-righteous, so be it.
Mm-hmm. Not really.
I was by Walden Pond for 5 hours, and it was a beautiful summer's day, glorious sunshine, and the flowers were in full bloom, and I was there for 4.5 hours when a neighbor came out and asked me, "Henry, are you okay? You've been sitting at this pond, just staring out at the pond for 5 hours." And I said to her quite instantaneously, "I've been observing the bullfrogs," which I had been doing for 5 hours. Time got away. I wasn't aware of what time it was. I was just aware of the beauty that was in front of me that I was able to appreciate without the need of knowing what time it was. If we fast forward now,
so I'm hearing, and I'm overlaying my experience and my what my observations onto your observations and experience. But you were really, in fact, controlling time rather than time controlling you.
That's basically what I was doing. But I was so absorbed in the fluctuations and the subtleties of nature that were manifesting themselves right in front of my own eyes. I was not concerned with time. I was very, very enhanced and very, very exalted in what I was watching, and those were bullfrogs.
That's something that a lot of people nowadays may never have the opportunity or allow themselves the opportunity. I mean, we work a 40-hour week, a 50-hour week, even sometimes a 60-hour week, a lot of us. But that still leaves us quite a bit of time to do. Well, if there's 168 hours in a week and you work 60, you can do the math that you have 108 hours to sleep, eat, and spend time in whatever you really want to do. And people certainly have the opportunity to take 4 or 5 hours a number of times during the week and do exactly as you did, whether they're sitting at Lake Kenosia or over at Metcalfer Park in Bethel or Huntington Park in Reading, and do exactly like you
Well, it seems
did.
to me my behavior now would be not an ultimate, but it would certainly be considered somewhat of an aberration.
Yeah.
And I would say to those people that would consider it, call it an eccentricity, that's okay.
Yeah.
But I would not call it an aberration. I would call it an enhancement of good time.
And it certainly doesn't have to be that way.
We don't
people
question,
have the opportunity to do that.
This
Mm-hmm.
culture does not really seem to question people that would sit and flock or even individualistically
Mm-hmm.
in front of electronic components that convey messages
Yeah.
that are less than sincere on your TVs. One of the things that I've always been a big proponent on is the reason why I love nature is because she is musically and cheerfully earnest. She never lies. She never cheats. Whereas the message that the media sends out is in my interpretation, not the message that has a genuineness of nature. There seems to be a confusion with how people should think and what they should think. Basically, what I'm saying is the media that is in 2011, from my observation here, is replete with deception. In telling people what they have to have, making people feel guilty if they don't have enough material things. Isn't there a slogan, the person with the most toys wins? That was not in my day.
The person with the most toys at the end of the game wins, and you're right, certainly, and I think having been pretty much all the way across the spectrum myself, having been fairly wealthy at times in my life, and you see the ebb and the flux of material wealth through a person sees it through their life. But it doesn't really make you any happier. And maybe perhaps a person that's never been wealthy can aspire to wealth and hold it out as the carrot at the end of the stick. But they never see what I've seen in being fairly wealthy at times. And what you see when you're wealthy is you realize that material goods don't make you any happier. They really don't make you any happier. And that could be a little bit of a disappointment when you get to that point and find that there's nothing there for you.
Well, if we connect the dots, we can honestly see that there's a correlation between the rapid evolution of technology and the media's control in perpetuating people into the insatiable consumption of maybe goods and maybe things that they don't necessarily need.
Now, you talked a lot.
There's fine lines.
You talked a lot during your life about poverty, about what voluntary poverty, about intentionally keeping yourself less than wealthy, tamping down your wealth intentionally, maybe not working as much as you could have or not as hard as you could have, in order to provide yourself with time, the value of time rather than the value of material goods. And something about a man being actually enriched by making these decisions to voluntarily keep himself lower in terms of material goods. What exactly did you mean by that?
Well, what I basically mean is contrasting 2011 with 1840.
Yeah.
There seems to be a tremendous consumption of time.
When you were about 23 years old, and you were in the what nowadays would be the youth of your life, but then when people only lived 50, 60, 70 years old, that was pretty far into their life. So you were an adult at that point, certainly.
To contrast then to now, it seems like there's a tremendous and almost inordinate amount of time that is consumed by people in working. And once they're at work, a lot of people, because of the pressures of economic want, economic excess, I might say, are under a lot of stress. So it's one thing that they're working so many hours.
Yeah.
It's another thing that they're working under a lot of stress because we've evolved to a very bureaucratic workforce. You have to remember, in my day, the workforce were the mom and pop grocery stores, the gardening. I did do my surveying. My dad had a small little pencil factory. Now we have that. I shouldn't say we. I am not part of it. But you and your culture has the corporation that has become a very, very ominous.
Yeah, sort of a monolith in a way.
Monolithic.
Yeah.
A very, very dangerous and a very, very, sometimes even diabolical form of our society, form of the workforce that we've evolved into. People have been numberized.
Yeah.
So they don't, when I said people, I am enriched by involuntary poverty, I took that that philosophy in so far as I did not want to enslave myself to the work ethic that promoted my detachment from leisurely time. I'd rather have leisurely time with either a good book, talking with a good friend, than have, in my day, what was a luxury, maybe a big boat. There weren't that many, a big house. I chose to forego all those for more leisurely time with my own thoughts.
And that's certainly something that I think a lot of people do recognize today, but don't have the will or the determination to do that, to do what they know is right for themselves.
Well, all is not lost, Dave. I see hints and movements in that direction with this occupying Wall Street, this protest that's going on Wall Street against the corporations, where now the people that are involved in these protests do not have a set agenda. But I think the agenda is deep down in their hearts that cannot be really put on a graph or really put on a blueprint.
Okay.
But I think basically what they are looking for is that sense of fairness.
We are tied by the constraints of time, unfortunately, here. But I am going to plead of you to come back and do a second session. We are going to do a second session. We'll be back in a few minutes. It's Progressive Soup. Henry David Thoreau is going to stay with us through his good graces and talk a little bit more. Thanks very much. Good evening. We'll be back in a few minutes by the miracle of modern television. Thanks.